Why does the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's Syrian regime showcase just how weak Russia has become? It's an interesting question, not least because the regime collapse occurred in an entirely different continent to the one in which Russia is trying to project power through its special military operation in Ukraine. For the country's president Vladimir Putin, power is everything. It's the foundation on which his entire reign is built. The erosion of that power spells big trouble for his authoritarian style of rule. And erosion is exactly what has happened with the fall of Bashar al-Assad. The former Syrian dictator's collapse has dealt a massive blow to Russia, exposing it as a geopolitical paper tiger that can no longer command the respect Putin so desperately craves on the global stage. Why? That's the question we'll answer in this video, as we explore all of the ways that the fall of Assad showcases just how weak Russia has become. And we start with the entire reason that Russia was in Syria to begin with: the Middle East foothold. In 2015, around 4 years into the Syrian civil war, Russia decided that it was going to come down hard on the side of the country's despotic leader, Assad. By September of that year, tanks and artillery were on their way into Syria as part of a military buildup that would allow Russia's forces to establish a presence in Assad's support. Among the tanks were 7 T-90s, Russia's most modern and prestigious service tank, which showcased just how serious Putin was about dipping his fingers into the Middle Eastern pie. Of course, all of this support wasn't offered without repayment. As hundreds of Russian troops turned into thousands based in Syria, Assad repaid Putin's militaristic generosity with both friendship and bases within Syrian territory. With help from Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, Assad managed to quash the uprising that led to the Syrian civil war, with the early 2020s reinforcing the Syrian dictator's rule and bringing with them a time of relative peace, at least in terms of Assad's position as the country's leader. Russia prospered in Syria as a result of its intervention. Putin established a massive military footprint in Syria that included a pair of 49-year leases, one for an air base in Hamaimim and another for a naval base in Tartus. That footprint kept growing. Through those bases, Russia was able to deploy tens of thousands of soldiers into Syria. But those numbers declined when Putin started his special military operation in Ukraine. Russian soldiers were still in Syria, guarding the two bases and establishing other military facilities within the country. The Washington Post says Russia established a pair of sites for its S-400 aerial defense systems, along with at least 2 more air bases during this time. All of those bases combined to represent Russia's foothold in the Middle East. They allowed the country to work alongside other major influences in the region, particularly Iran, as well as allowing Russia to essentially turn Syria into a client state. Now, the futures of those bases are in question. With Assad's fall comes the possibility that the rebel forces that now control Syria will boot Russia out of their country. Russia will, of course, try to prevent this from happening. It already claims that it's in contact with Syria's armed opposition. The Washington Post also says there doesn't appear to be any evidence of Russian soldiers fleeing the bases at Hamaimim and Tartus, though those claims may be faulty, as you'll see in a moment. But there's also no denying that Russia's presence in Syria is on shaky ground. The country's foreign ministry says that all of its bases are on a high state of alert, while also claiming that there is no serious threat to them at the current time. A contradiction in terms, it seems, and one that suggests that Russia has no real idea what its future in Syria looks like just yet. With Assad in power, Moscow had a stable foothold in the Middle East, through which it could influence the region's politics. Now that foothold appears to be crumbling from underneath it. There's still a chance that Russia could make good with the rebel forces, so that it can maintain its presence in Syria. But will the leaders of those forces be as willing to cooperate with Russia or place themselves under Putin's thumb in the same way Assad did? It seems unlikely. So even if Russia is able to maintain its bases in Syria, there's a good chance that it has been severely weakened because it will no longer have the influence it once did, and Russia appears to know this. Though the Washington Post claims that Russia is trying to stay put in its Syrian bases, satellite imagery shows that the opposite may be true. One such set of clips filmed between December 1st and 3rd appears to show the Russian frigates Admiral Golovko and Admiral Gorshkov steaming out of the Tartus base flanked by a pair of tankers and a patrol ship named Grirovich. Those aren't the actions of a country that feels in any way confident that it will be able to maintain its foothold in Syria. Its ships were fleeing as HTS rebels launched their attacks against Assad, showcasing just how little support Syria's former president received from his supposed ally. Russian troops on the ground didn't fare much better. In footage shared to X by Sophia Research, we can see HTS fighters driving through the joint Syrian and Russian armored vehicle school base close to Hama. The base is abandoned, a military ghost town with no troops around, though there are still plenty of Russian vehicles and tanks parked within its confines. So not only did Russia abandon the base, but it did it so quickly that it left valuable equipment behind. we see another sign of Russia's increasing weakness. It abandoned bases and did so while HTS forces had still yet to depose Assad, and it's willingly relinquishing its Middle Eastern foothold, grasping onto the elusive hope that the rebels will somehow come to the conclusion that it's a good idea to keep the very Russian troops that oppressed them for so long around. As usual, Russia is now trying to institute some damage control. What happened in Syria wasn't Russia's fault, the Kremlin claims. Playing the blame game, the Kremlin is using its mouthpieces in Russia's media to lay all of the fault for Syria's collapse at the feet of the country's military. Speaking on a state TV weekly news show, anchor Yevgeny Kiselev says, "In Aleppo, for example, positions were given up virtually without a fight. Fortified areas were surrendered one after another and then blown up, despite government troops being better equipped and outnumbering the attacking side many times over." The entire affair was a mystery, according to Kiselev, who seems to be parroting the Kremlin's assertion that Assad should have been able to defend himself against the HTS surge. But Assad failed, and Russia is now asserting that there was little it could have done to prevent the dictator's collapse. But the satellite imagery showing Russian ships fleeing its most important Syrian naval base, along with the footage of abandoned armored vehicles, suggests otherwise. Russia would have helped Assad maintain his grip, but due to the lack of manpower in the region, it just couldn't. So they instead decided to beat a hasty retreat and leave a Syrian army that was heavily reliant on Russian forces to fend for itself. The only Russian response to the HTS attack was to launch a handful of targeted airstrikes, and even then those strikes didn't seem to target military installations. For instance, aerial assaults on December 2nd struck 5 healthcare facilities in the HTS stronghold of Idlib, killing 18 and injuring at least 35 people. Russia seemed to target civilians with the paltry air support it offered to Assad, only to later think better of this approach and try to escape Syria altogether. Despite the Kremlin assigning blame to Syria's military, the reality is that Russia simply wasn't strong enough to defend its client state against an attack, and it's far from the first time that that's happened in recent memory. As the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, points out, Syria's collapse highlights that Russia is no longer in a position to play its self-assigned role as a security guarantor for the nations that fall under its protective umbrella. It failed in Syria despite having a network of 114 military bases in the country, and it also failed in several other countries. Take Armenia as an example. In September 2023, Azerbaijan launched a counter-terrorism operation intended to disarm Armenian forces in Nagorno-Karabakh. It succeeded, needing little more than a day to take the region, which Armenia dubbed Artsakh, and rid it of its occupying troops. Why does this matter in the context of Russia's weakening? Well, Putin and his cronies were supporting Armenia when this operation took place. In fact, CEPA notes that Russian peacekeepers were alongside the Armenian soldiers who surrendered in Nagorno-Karabakh and offered little resistance once a senior Russian officer had been killed. Russia essentially stood by as Azerbaijan forced the exodus of around 120,000 Armenians from the region. That didn't sit too well with Armenia. The country's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan publicly decried the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, an alternative to NATO, led by Russia and formed in the wake of the Nagorno-Karabakh incident. It eventually withdrew from the alliance as support for CSTO membership dropped to just 17% in the country. In contrast, the support in Armenia for joining NATO reached 29% during the same period. And as if to put an exclamation point on how the country felt about Russia's inability to help it protect what it saw as its territory, Armenia also joined the International Criminal Court, or ICC, in June 2024. That membership comes with an obligation to arrest Putin per an ICC warrant issued in March 2023. Pashinyan also accused Russia of not fulfilling their contractual obligations to Armenia around the same time it joined the ICC, as well as planning a war against us with Azerbaijan. Just like that, another Russian ally was lost because Putin failed to come to its defense. We're now seeing the same in Syria, and this pattern of Russian failure exists elsewhere within the CSTO. For instance, CEPA points out that a January 2024 border dispute between CSTO members Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan was solved not by Russia, but through Turkish-led mediation. Remember that Russia is supposed to lead the CSTO, but it failed to do anything on Kyrgyzstan's behalf during the border conflict, and allowed another country to mediate the conflict, gaining influence with the two CSTO members in the bargain. It all points to a country that's too weak to defend its own. And with that weakness comes a decline in influence. The Middle East foothold is slipping away. CSTO members are either abandoning the organization or relying on countries other than Russia to help them handle their disputes. Assad's fall in Syria is just the most recent and biggest example of what we've known for well over a year. The Russian Federation under Putin is crumbling. The obvious question now is why? And the answer reveals even more about how weak Russia has become, particularly since Putin started his special military operation back in February 2022. So much of Russia's current inability to defend the countries with which it allies traces back to the Ukraine war. As SIPA points out, that's a conflict to which Russia commits 300,000 of its soldiers, notwithstanding those that have been lost to death or injury along the way. Severe equipment losses also abound in the war, limiting Moscow's ability to send soldiers or weaponry elsewhere. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance claims that Russia has suffered the loss of 755,940 soldiers as of December 10th. Every day brings with it news of even more losses. Over 9,500 Russian tanks are either destroyed or disabled in Ukraine. Russia has burned through over 21,000 artillery systems and has lost hundreds, sometimes even thousands, of its armored fighting vehicles, anti-aircraft weapons, planes, and choppers. The country is losing all of its equipment at a time when it's suffering more battlefield casualties in Ukraine than ever before. In November, Russia broke its own record for single-day losses in the Ukraine war twice, first hitting 1,950 casualties in a day on November 12th before losing 2,030 on November 28th. That last record-breaking day capped a month in which Russia lost 45,680 soldiers amidst its counteroffensive in Kursk and its constant pushing against Ukraine in the Donbass. The manpower situation is so bad for Russia that it's now relying on North Korea to help it out, as evidenced by the 11,000 to 12,000 North Korean soldiers that are currently playing a part in the Kursk counteroffensive. Think about that for a moment. Russia's losses in Ukraine are so extensive that Putin has been forced to align himself with one of the few nations in the world that's more isolated than his own in global geopolitics. Accepting North Korean soldiers into the Russian fold smacks of desperation, and it's a sign that Russia is really struggling to sustain the meat grinder it's created in Ukraine. Plus the fact that the country has churned through so many of its own people in nearly 3 years of war, all as part of an operation that was meant to be over in less than a week, shows that Russia can't deliver decisive blows in its own campaigns. It's also far too drained to do so now. All Putin can do is continue to force increasingly incompetent soldiers into his meat grinder in the hope that the constant pressure will be enough to net him a win against Ukraine. It's a win he sorely needs amidst so many losses. So we have several ways in which the toppling of Assad showcases Russia's weakness. Putin has lost the Middle Eastern foothold he so carefully cultivated with the Russian intervention into Syria back in 2015. Now he's left hanging around hoping that HTS will find some reason to keep his forces in the country, at least the forces that are left, as more signs of Russian weakness come from its limited response to the HTS rebel attacks and its fleeing from key military bases throughout Syria. Add to that Syria being emblematic of a pattern of Russian failure to protect its client and satellite states amidst its massive material and manpower losses in Ukraine, and you have a drained country that can do little more than watch as its burgeoning empire crumbles around it. And it gets even worse. What's happening in Syria only confirms what we've seen in Ukraine and elsewhere over the last few years. Russia's weapons are nowhere near as strong as Putin would like people to believe. We already mentioned that Russia brought T-90 tanks over to Syria during its 2015 intervention in the Syrian civil war. Those are far from the only Russian weapons that were in the country when HTS launched its attack. Multiple ships were also stationed in Syria, and as Defense Express points out, Russian weapons are being treated like trophies by the rebel forces that have taken the country. Images show the rebels capturing Pantsir S-1 air defense systems. The rebels also managed to take several aircraft, including an L-39, along with helicopters and aerial bombs when they captured Kuiris Air Base. Strela 10 surface-to-air missiles have fallen into HTS hands. The obvious question is why weren't these weapons used against the rebel fighters? The answer may be that they simply aren't strong enough to do the job, resulting in Russian forces abandoning them to HTS hands rather than attempting to use them. This is just a hint that Russia's weaponry isn't doing its job. SIPA highlights more, noting that Hezbollah has lost around 4,000 soldiers since the end of October, with most being equipped with Russian small arms. Israeli airstrikes have also decimated practically all of the Russian-made S-300 air systems stationed in Iran, with those missile launchers having recorded no successful strikes against Israel's missiles or bombs in return. Losses upon losses of equipment that was meant to defend the countries in which it was stationed. Russia's past arms customers have also started whispering about how weak its weaponry truly is. As BBC Ukraine reported on December 3rd, India has shelved many of its plans to jointly produce weapons with Russia. Talks to jointly make helicopters and advanced fighter jets were shelved months before Assad's downfall, along with a plan to lease a Russian nuclear submarine to train Indian crews. Right now, India has just a pair of warships and batteries for one of its anti-missile shield on order from Russia, both purchased before the Ukraine war, with little else incoming. Don't underestimate how important India was to Russia's arms trade. As the world's largest weapons importer, India purchased 76% of its arms from Russia in 2009. That number declined to 36% in 2023, with the shortfall being picked up by NATO-aligned nations. You could argue that India's lower purchase volumes are a natural result of the Ukraine war sucking up Russia's resources, itself a sign of Russian weakness. But it's also likely that India has seen the much larger Russian force fail to take Ukraine over the course of nearly 3 years, and has concluded that NATO equipment is far superior to the shoddy Russian equipment it was buying. In Southeast Asia, we've seen a similar downswing in Russian weapons since early 2023. In the 2 decades up to the start of Putin's special military operation, Russia was the region's top arms dealer, with sales of $11 billion in weapons. But even back then, countries were abandoning deals, such as we saw when Indonesia cancelled its purchase of Russian Su-35s, and the Philippines chose not to buy Russian helicopters it had previously ordered in the 2010s. Since the start of the Ukraine war, Russian arms sales in the region have fallen off a cliff, with South Korea stepping in to fill the hole, according to The Economist. It all adds up to signs of more weakness in Russia. In fact, countries were gravitating away from its weapons before the Ukraine war started, and in the war itself, Russia has proven time and time again that its vaunted weapon systems aren't anywhere near as powerful as Putin claims. What happened in Syria merely confirmed what was becoming clear: Russian weapons aren't fit for purpose. Russia's troops choosing to abandon their equipment rather than use their weapons to battle back against the HTS forces only reinforced the idea. And that brings us to the final way that the Syrian collapse has shown us just how weak Russia truly is. It will make Russia's allies think twice about aligning with the country in the future. Imagine you lead North Korea right now. In the summer of 2024, you signed a cooperative defense pact with Putin, which means Russia has committed to coming to your aid should you ever face an attack on your country's soil. Around 6 months later, you hear the news about what happened in Syria. A key Russian ally was overrun, and Putin's forces did nothing about it other than launch a couple of airstrikes before they fled the scene. How much value would your defense pact now hold? Was Russia really the right country to get into bed with? These are the sorts of questions that countries like North Korea and the nations aligned with Russia through the CSTO will now be asking themselves. The same may go for Iran and China. What's happened in Syria, and to a lesser extent, the Armenia situation, shows just how much value those countries can place on Putin's word that Russia will come to their aid if they're in a crisis. As SIPA points out, Russia's security guarantees are increasingly seen as undeliverable, the sign of a country strong on rhetoric but weak in action. That action-based weakness may deliver the biggest blow to Russia yet seen. It's already lost Syria and all of the Middle Eastern influence that came with it. Perhaps it's going to lose its relationships with other allies and those that fall under its protective umbrella in the future, weakening it even further. After all, what nation would believe it could rely on Russian intervention now after what happened to Assad? Perhaps you have the answer to that question. Let us know your thoughts about all of these signs of Russia's weakness and what they mean for Putin as we move into 2025 in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Trump's peace plan for Ukraine will cause the collapse of Russia, or click this other video instead.